Hello, AP Environmental Science students. My name is Dr. Sowell, and we are going to jump into the review section. So far, Ms. Fassler and I have been going over new content from Unit 8 and 9, and now we are going to go back to Unit 1 and start reviewing the rest of the course. So my job today is to start tackling some of that Unit 1 stuff. Just as a quick reminder, here's the information about our exam date on May 18th. And a quick reminder again that we have 2 FRQs, 60% of which will be the design and investigation FRQ, which will ask you to do these types of skills. And then 40% is going to be the propose a solution FRQ, which will ask for these skills. So just as a warm up, let's kind of review what we did last time. So last time we looked at human impacts on biodiversity, and particularly we looked at HIPCO. And we went through each of those letters to talk about how humans have had an impact on biodiversity. But we spent quite a bit of time on habitat loss, fragmentation, protected area planning, and habitat corridors. So for homework, I left you with this part of the 2013 FRQ question number 4. So B said, identify 2 specific activities that result in a loss of biodiversity and explain how each one does lower it. And then C asks you to propose a strategy for each one of those 2 things. So let's look at the answers in terms of what's on the scoring guidelines. So you could have said something like clearing land for homes or constructions or for logging. All of that is just going to reduce habitat or fragment habitat. Agriculture is going to do the same thing, but it also has implications for genetic variation. Domestication typically leads to less genetic variation, so things like monocultures. Overfishing, overhunting, overpoaching, reducing species, especially endangered ones. Water contamination, nutrient depletion or nutrient pollution, dropping the DO, the dissolved oxygen. Burning fossil fuels, there's always a good culprit to blame. And so we can look at how that's causing climate change or even issues of acid rain. Then we've got invasive species. We talked about that with Ms. Fassler the other day and how that might displace native species. Dams, we mentioned this yesterday actually, about how dams could fragment habitats. And finally, surface mining and how that could destroy habitats. So there was a lot of things that you could have answered, but it had to be structured in this way. The activity has to be identified, and then you have to explain how each activity lowers biodiversity. So let's take a look at a student sample here. So this one says, cutting down forests to build homes causes loss of habitats for species to live, so they are forced to migrate. Well, there's points right there. Cutting down forest, there's the activity. What is the explanation of why it causes loss of habitats? So there's 2 points right there. The second part says hunting can lower biodiversity because it can lower populations to a point where they can repopulate quick enough and they go extinct. So there again, we get hunting as the activity and how that could drive an endangered species to extinction. So this student would have gotten all 4 points for this answer. So you'll remember that the next question says, take these 2 things now and talk about some solutions to each one. So here are some possibilities. So for the clearing land for agriculture or logging, you could do smart growth, compact development, kind of smart city planning, or you could just replant trees or do selective cutting. Agriculture, you can look at issues of polyculture or using IPM, integrated pest management. Overfishing or overhunting, we could look at CITES, the international ban on trading of endangered species, or our national law here in the United States, the ESA, the Endangered Species Act. Water contamination, you could look at regulations on those point sources of water pollution, or you could look at wastewater treatment facilities as a solution. Climate change, looking at all the carbon sequestration issues, carbon cap and trade, switching to renewable energy sources, and then clearly for acid rain, stick a scrubber on the smokestack, reduces some of that SOx getting into the air. Invasive species, you can kind of check those, tighter enforcement of what's coming in, and then education, always a great solution. Dams, put in fish ladders, salmon ladders that allow the fish to migrate past the dam. And then for surface mining, you could enforce the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, the SMCRA. But that's probably not one that we'll focus on today too much. So let's see what this person wrote. Remember, their two original things was cutting down trees and hunting. So they start off by saying ecosystems that are very highly diverse should be protected and turned into wildlife refuges and parks so they can't get torn down or changed by humans in a negative way. So let's stop there for a minute. Nothing that they said is really wrong. Those are actually nice ideas, but it doesn't address the issue of logging or cutting down trees. In order to get those points, we would have had to say, what's the solution here? The second part says hunt during certain times when the animals aren't breeding so they can reproduce to repopulate the animals killed and they won't be overhunted. Here we get the point for talking about how to regulate that hunting. So the person gets 1 point out of 2 because they didn't do the part on trees, on cutting. All right, so again, this pattern is something Ms. Fassler and I are going to go back and forth on every other day. So I'll leave you today with an FRQ chunk to work on, and she'll go over the answer tomorrow. All right, so let's see where we're going to go today. This is kind of our content goal. We're going to look at 1.1, which is Introduction to Ecosystems, 1.8, Primary Productivity, 1.9, Trophic Levels, 1.10, Energy Flow and the 10% Rule, and finally 1.11, Food Chains, Food Webs. Now, that's a lot. There's a lot of topics in what I'm going to cover in a short period of time today. My thoughts are some of this content is probably things that you remember from biology or maybe even middle school sciences or other life science courses. So this isn't a time to really go into super depth. And plus, you've already learned this stuff once already. So this is just going to be a quick review of the basics. And then I'm going to try to find a few points throughout these units to go, okay, let's stop and use it, because that's what the FRQs are going to ask us to do. It's not going to say, you know, just give me a quick little piece of information. It's going to ask you to identify and describe and explain and justify all those task verbs. So we'll try to find some time to do that today. And then particularly, we're going to focus on environmental solutions. So proposing and justifying solutions to problems. All right, so when we look at that practice, remember, it does go from more simple to more complex, all the way from what's the problem, what are the potential solutions, evaluating those solutions with data and evidence, and then making a justification and a claim for which one to use. So here we go. This is 1.1. So by the end of this section, you should be able to explain the availability of resources, or explain how the availability of resources influence species interactions. So let's pause and just kind of deconstruct that a little bit. So availability of resources, species interactions. What this is getting at is that the way species interact with each other is dependent on the availability of resources that they need, and certain resources in particular. Things like limiting factors and limited resources. So we'll look at that a little bit more. So to get there, we're going to start by looking at predator-prey relationship. We'll look at how limited resources affects competition. And then we'll look at a specific phenomenon called resource partitioning. And then finally, we'll end with symbiosis. All right, so let's eat some stuff. So here's a picture of an egret eating a fish. So in a predator-prey relationship, the predator is the organism that eats another organism, which is the prey. And we represent this in food webs and food chains by using the arrow. And remember that the arrow represents the flow of energy from one organism to the next. A common misconception is for students to write the arrow the wrong way. But remember, the arrow shows where the energy is going, where are the nutrients going from one organism to the next during predation. So now let's kind of look at competition. So we've got a little lizard here chowing down on a grasshopper, and that would be represented by our grasshopper arrow lizard. But what happens if there's another lizard of that same species nearby? They're starting to compete for the same food resource. And if we throw in another one of the same species, now we've got a lot of members of the same population competing for a food source. So what competition is, it's about limited resources. These lizards are not competing for oxygen. Do they all need oxygen? Yes. But oxygen is not a limited resource. There's plenty in abundance of it. So these lizards are not evolving mechanisms to help them better compete for oxygen. What they're doing is evolving better strategies to compete for something like food. So we can have competition within species. So this green anole, this green anole, this green anole, same species, and they're all competing for the same thing. Or we can have competition between species. So here's our green anole, but we've also got a couple of brown anoles, this trunk anole, Anolis cybotes. So now we've got a bunch of different species of anoles all competing for the same resource. And so what this kind of points us to is that competition for limited resources between species is stronger when species have similar niches. So let me say that again. If a bunch of species, like these 4 species of lizard, have similar niches, similar ways in which they use the resources around them, then that means the competition is going to be stronger. So let's do a non-example. A whale and a zebra. Their niches have hardly any overlap. They do not compete really at all with each other for any kind of limited resource. But there are certain species like these lizards who live in the same area who do. So the question then becomes, how are these guys all existing in the same location? Why aren't they out competing each other and driving some to extinction with only 1 or 2 left? Because this is what we saw with invasive species. So if you remember back when we talked about lionfish, these lionfish are an invasive species here off the coast of Florida and the coast of the southeastern United States. And what we see is these invasive lionfish have a similar niche to these other larger fish. So their niches are very similar, just like those lizards were back here. So these lizards have similar niches, but so do we have it here. But in this situation, the lionfish has just been introduced into this environment very quickly, and it's become an invasive species. And so it outcompetes these native fish for food. That's called competitive exclusion. The competition, it's winning the game and it's excluding these members that were there before it. So the native population of the fish goes down and the overall biodiversity goes down. So the question remains, why doesn't this situation where one species dominates over the others, why doesn't that happen in nature? In nature, if you go into the forests of the Dominican Republic, for example, you might find 7 or 8 different anoles living in the exact same place at the exact same time, eating the exact same thing, seemingly. So how are they coexisting? And that's a question we're going to dive into here. So the answer really is something called resource partitioning. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as niche partitioning, but for the purposes here, we'll say resource partitioning. And it's a way in which using the different resources in different ways or places or at times can reduce the negative impact of competition. So resource partitioning reduces competition and therefore promotes biodiversity. Remember, a healthy ecosystem and a stable ecosystem has high species richness and lots of different species in the one community. So what we want is we want competition to not be strong enough that it drives that biodiversity away. So what we can do is we can see organisms start to share resources in different ways. So for example, if we go and look at the steenbok, the kudu, and the giraffe, all 3 of these organisms are eating from this tree, but they're eating at different heights of the tree. So they have partitioned this resource so that they can coexist. Same thing happens with the zebra and the wildebeest, for example. But this time, instead of a spatial separation, they're doing it temporally over time, so that we see while the zebra and the wildebeest eat the exact same species of grass, one's doing it a little bit earlier and one's doing it a little bit later. So you can have species resource partition by space, or by time, or maybe even by what they eat. Here's another example. This is a famous example of warblers in trees. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different species of warblers, all coexisting in the same tree because they utilize different locations within the tree. So we're going to take a look at Dr. Rob Pringle's work in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. So to give you a little bit of background, Gorongosa National Park currently does not have the biodiversity that it used to have and the species richness that it used to have because of a civil war many decades ago when many of the large larger organisms were killed or used as bushmeat during the Civil War. But now that the Civil War is over, Dr. Pringle and the rest of the scientists, they are trying to rebuild the biodiversity of the park. And so if we think about all those lizards living together harmoniously because of resource partitioning, but then that lionfish problem where they didn't live together because it happened so quickly, what he's trying to figure out is how do they rebuild the biodiversity of this park in the best way possible? And then to do that, he has to understand how all of those different herbivores resource partition. So here's him talking about the issue.
African savannas are famous for their diversity of large mammals. But how do so many similar species coexist in the same place? Princeton University biologist Rob Pringle is captivated by this question, one of the enduring mysteries of ecology. His team is working in Mozambique's Gorongosa National Park. Their focus is 3 closely related species of antelope: bushbuck, nyala, and kudu.
So if we just kind of pause and think about that so far, they've just pointed out 3 different species of herbivores, and these 3 species of herbivores therefore have a very overlapped set of niches. Their niches overlap quite a bit. So he needs to understand how have they partitioned their resources so that they can coexist.
They all occur here in the same kind of habitat, and they differ in size. So that enables us to look at how each species is utilizing the habitat and how do they avoid competing with each other so strongly that they start driving one another extinct.
These species live in savanna, grasslands interspersed with small clumps of trees. At the heart of each clump is a termite mound. Termites concentrate soil nutrients and moisture, enabling the growth of palatable trees and shrubs rarely found elsewhere.
So this is forage that's just incredibly nutritious. I mean, this is cheeseburger, basically.
Ecological theory predicts that to coexist, each species must occupy a unique niche, defined by the combination of habitats and foods it uses.
So we've kind of defined the issue here. And so what he did is he went into the field and tracked down different members of these 3 species, and then took dung samples and analyzed the DNA inside their dung to figure out what plants in particular they were eating. I mean, if you look at these 3 organisms from a distance through a set of binoculars, they're all bending down, grazing on what looks like grass. But he had a hypothesis that perhaps they were eating different things on the ground. Well, the only way to really tell that is to do a DNA analysis of their dung to see what they were eating. So here's what he found out.
What our DNA metabarcoding studies have revealed is this really interesting picture of how animals partition the niche.
Each species uses the habitat differently and feeds on a different combination of plant species in varying proportions. Such niche partitioning reduces the strength of competition, preventing a single species from monopolizing all of the resources. In this way, all 3 species can coexist.
So what we're finding is that plant diversity may be really important in helping to maintain large mammal diversity. The presence of termite mounds is actually increasing what might otherwise be a fairly monotonous, homogeneous landscape and adding more diversity to it.
The Pringle Lab's work is revealing how food webs are organized and biodiversity maintained. And it reminds us that ecological communities are profoundly interconnected.
So what we saw there was over time, over evolutionary time, these 3 organisms have evolved to separate their resources or their niche in unique ways. Well, why didn't that happen with the lionfish? Because it happened so quickly. That was an invasive species that we introduced into that system, and there hasn't been time for those organisms to partition the resources, and therefore we see the lionfish outcompeting some of the native fish. So again, hopefully you're starting to see the trend here with the practices. If we identify the problem, use some scientific data to study it, and then to propose a particular solution. So thinking about solutions, could you examine a food web in a particular ecosystem and describe the effects of a particular anthropogenic disturbance like clear cutting? So if you were presented with a food web or a food chain, could you identify some of the negative consequences of a human disruption or anthropogenic disruption? So during those solution finding times, when you're trying to figure out what's the solution, be sure that every time you do so, you identify the pros, the cons, and any possible unintended consequences of that solution. So now we're going to go into the symbiosis part of 1.1, and this says symbiosis is a long-term interaction between two species in an ecosystem, and it can be mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So as a quick review, here's a good example of mutualism. We talked about this during our coral bleaching discussion. So this is a coral polyp, and inside the tissues of the coral lives a little algae. And so the algae get this great home to live in, and the corals get the products of the photosynthesis. So both species are benefiting from this close relationship, so mutualism. Commensalism, one benefits, the other's not harmed, no big whoop. So think about barnacles on a whale. These barnacles get transported to these plankton-rich environments. They get plenty of food to feed, but the whale, as far as we know, it's just got stuff on it. It's not really hurting the whale, so it's commensalism. And finally, good old parasitism, parasites. So this is an example of a tapeworm. Humans can sometimes get tapeworms. They can infect dogs too. So you may have seen veterinarians give dogs dewormer to try to get rid of those tapeworms. But the tapeworms are the thing that benefit. They're inside the intestine, feeding off the nutrients and stealing that nutrients from the host animal. All right, so at this point, that's kind of 1.1. So you should be able to explain how the availability of resources influences interactions. So we looked at predator-prey, competition, niche partitioning or resource partitioning, and symbiosis. All of those are different ways in which organisms or different species interact with each other. So now we're going to jump to 1.8, primary productivity. So at the end of this section, you should be able to explain how solar energy is acquired and then transferred by living organisms. So to get there, we're going to describe what primary productivity is, describe the differences between GPP and NPP, and finally explain how NPP relates to different ecosystems. So these phrases GPP, NPP, I will define in just a second. All right, so let's just define productivity or primary productivity to begin with. This is just how much photosynthesis is going on in an area. So this is the rate, so it is a rate at which solar energy is converted into organic compounds via photosynthesis over a unit of time. And it actually has a very specific unit of measurements, or a type of specific unit of measurements, where it's energy per area over time. So you might think that, my front yard of a couple, square meters, that is going to have a lower productivity rate than maybe a giant forest, because there's more plants doing more photosynthesis. And so the rate is a little bit different. So just think of productivity as how much photosynthesis or the rate of photosynthesis that's going on. Also think about productivity as the battery. I always think of productivity or the amount of photosynthesis as the battery that drives everything else in that food web. It's the source of everything. Now, obviously, it originates from the sun, but the plants are the things that turn that sunlight into organic compounds that then can be transported throughout the ecosystem. And so keeping that in mind, think about how the productivity in a desert and the productivity of a tropical rainforest might influence the biodiversity or species richness in those two locations. So there is a connection between productivity and overall biodiversity or species richness. All right, so let's talk about those letters, GPP, NPP. Tad bit confusing. So this is definitely a place I would pause and look at a couple of times. I'm going to try to explain it the best I can, but sometimes it's good to hear other people. So Google some other folks. So let's start with some sunlight. So the sunlight hits the grass and it makes what we call gross primary productivity. This is all the products of photosynthesis, all that organic compound that the grass has produced. That's everything. That's what the word gross means. So gross means everything. Now, the vast majority of that is used back by the plant for its own cellular respiration. So that energy, or that energy from the sun through GPP, a lot of it is lost through cellular respiration. Okay? What's left over is NPP, the net primary productivity. That's smaller. And that amount of organic material or organic compounds can be turned into tissues for the plant for it to grow and get bigger. So again, all of the sunlight hits all the grass and it makes gross primary productivity, all of the energy, all of the organic compounds. But a lot of that is lost to cellular respiration just by the plant undergoing cellular respiration. What's left over is the NPP. Now, why do we care about the NPP? That's what drives the rest of the food web. So gross, we lose a lot of that to cellular respiration. What's left over is net, and the net primary productivity, or NPP, is what can be passed on through the food web. So just remember this formula, that NPP is GPP minus cellular respiration. We, in terms of ecology, are much more interested in NPP because that's what drives the rest of the food web. So again, gross primary productivity is the total rate, and net primary productivity is the rate of energy storage by photosynthesizers in a given area after you subtract the energy lost to respiration. Okay, NPP is the energy that can feed into the rest of the food web. All right, so here's a global map of NPP. So just stare at it for a second and you might start to see some trends. We get some darker regions in the equatorial region. We see the Sahara Desert have very white, so very low NPP. And that should make some sense to you that not all ecosystems are going to have the same NPP. And in fact, if we look at a chart of ecosystems versus NPP, we can look down here at extreme desert, very low NPP. And then if we go way up here into swamps and marshes and tropical rainforests, very high NPP. So if we know that the amount of energy in NPP drives the ecosystem, we should be able to make some inferences about what kind of species richness and biodiversity we might find there. So you should now be able to explain how solar energy is acquired and transferred by living organisms. From the sun, GPP, lose some as respiration, what's left over is NPP, feeds the web. All right, so let's talk about that web. So food chains and food webs, you should be able to describe them and their constituent members by trophic level. So we've gotten energy from the sun into the plant and transferred to those first organisms. But now what? Where do we go from there? We got a deer, we've got a rabbit, we've got a grasshopper, we've got a caterpillar. What's next? And that's good old food chains, food webs. So let's just start this one out. So we've got a plant. It's consumed by the little mouse. The mouse is consumed by the snake. The snake is consumed by the owl. So here we have a food chain. This is a direct linear relationship between predator and prey. But once we start adding some more onto there, we start to see that our chain really becomes a web. And so that's the difference between food chain and food web. And remember, those arrows represent the flow of energy from one organism to the next. And then we've got how, if you remove a certain species or a certain organism from a food web, how does that change the other members of that food web in positive or negative ways? So for example, let's get rid of the grasshopper. Let's say that someone sprays some really heavy insecticide and kills off some of the grasshoppers. Well, what's that going to do to other organisms? Well, first of all, it's probably going to drop the population of frogs because frogs were relying on grasshoppers as a main part of their food source. So the population of frogs is going to go down. But the population of grass might go up because one of the predators of grass is now gone. And that might in turn increase the population of mice because their food resources are more because they're no longer competing with the grasshopper. In terms of what happens to the other ones, it's a little more unclear because if we look at this snake, one of its prey has gone down and one of its prey has gone up. So as we go a little bit farther up, we'd have to learn a little bit more to decipher those. So when we talk about disturbances like adding an invasive species or poaching or logging, any of those things, you should be able to look at a food web, find a disturbance, and talk about how that disturbance might affect other members of the food web. So then we have this idea of trophic levels. So the first trophic level is the producers, the primary producers. These are the plants that are undergoing photosynthesis. The next category of organisms are the primary consumers. The primary consumers are the ones that eat the producers. And then no surprise, we've got secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. Sometimes you will have quaternary consumers if we added an alligator in here to eat the heron. But these are the trophic levels that you'll need to be able to describe. So can we do this now? Can we describe food chains and food webs and their constituent members by trophic level? Okay, so hopefully you should be able to do that by now. All right, so if we look at 1.9 says in terrestrial and near surface marine communities, energy flows from the sun to the producers in the lowest trophic levels and then moves up. So that should be no surprise that the energy comes into the lower levels and moves up. But at the same time, we also have decomposition going on. These living things are decomposing and producing waste, and that connects the biosphere with the rest of the biogeochemical cycles. So the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the water cycle, all of those biogeochemical cycles are connected to trophic levels through decomposition and waste. We could look at the carbon cycle itself, going from atmospheric carbon into tissues of plants, plants dying and decomposing, maybe being compressed into sedimentary rock. So we can see that the food webs are clearly involved in all the biogeochemical cycles. But let's take a look at this question here for a second. Why in the world is this shaped like a pyramid and not a rectangle? Why do we have more stuff here at the bottom than we do at the top? Why are there more primary producers than there are tertiary consumers? Well, that has to do with the energy that's going on here. So we have something called the 10% rule, and that helps us to understand the fact that energy decreases as it flows through an ecosystem. So every time an organism eats another organism, that energy moves up, but we lose some of that energy from heat due to the second law of thermodynamics. So what we have is we have a little rule called the 10% rule, which approximates that in the transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next, only about 10% of that energy is passed on. Now, that 10%, that number is an average. Sometimes it's lower than that, sometimes it's higher than that, but the 10% rule gives us a nice guideline to understand it. So what that means is between the primary producers and the primary consumers, only about 10% of that energy makes it up here. That's why this is shaped like a pyramid, because we're losing a lot of that energy. And then again, only another 10, and then another 10. So every time we make a leap, only 10% goes to the next highest trophic level. So if we quantify that, if we wanted to put some numbers onto it, we could say that there's 3,500,000 kilocalories going on in the producers in this particular community, wherever this is. And then if we look at the next trophic level, the primary consumers, it's only going to have 350,000 kilocalories. And then that goes down to 35,000, and that goes down to 3,500. So we're losing energy as we go down, or as we go up. So this is really having to do with the first law of thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics, mainly the second one, because the second law says every time energy is transformed from one form to another, we lose some of that energy from heat. Again, now we should be able to figure out why it's not shaped like a rectangle, but it's more like a pyramid because of that 10% rule. All right, so let's do some checking for understanding. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer this question. Select the choice that best fits each statement. And so the statement says, it is exemplified by bees consuming nectar and carrying pollen from one flower to another. So take a few seconds and make your decision. All right, hopefully you've picked mutualism. So this is a mutualistic relationship type of symbiosis. Let's go to another example. Moss growing on a tree trunk in a forest. All right, so this would be commensalism. One is benefiting and the other one is, no big whoop. All right, let's go to this one. Losses of usable energy between successive trophic levels in an ecosystem are best accounted for by which of the following? And we just mentioned this a few minutes ago. So this is the second law of thermodynamics. That first law says that we can't create or destroy energy. And the second one says that every time we transfer energy from one form to another, we lose some as heat. This is an interesting little question. Of the following organisms, which occupies the lowest trophic level? So hopefully you picked deer. I know that sometimes my students will really get caught up on spider here because it's so small and tiny. But remember, the spider is eating other animals as opposed to the deer, which is eating the plant. So the deer is the primary consumer, lower than the spider on the trophic pyramid. All right, let's kind of see where we went today. So we started about how those resources, whether they're limited or not, really affects how species interact with each other. Then we jumped into primary productivity, NPP, and what it really means. Trophic levels, the trophic pyramid, and how that energy flow happens within that pyramid. And then we looked at food chains and food webs. There was a lot that I talked very quickly about. So here is your homework practice for tomorrow. So again, pay attention to the task verbs. These task verbs mean something and they tell you what types of writing you should be doing in your answer. So this is the Arctic food web question from a few years ago. So the first thing that you should notice here is this visual representation, this model of a food web. You should start looking at the direction of the arrows. You should start looking at who eats who, because the first question says, refer to the food web above to complete the following table. So identify a primary producer, identify a primary consumer, and identify a secondary consumer. So take 30 seconds and answer those three really quick. All right, so you should have said primary producer is the diatom, this phytoplankton down here. And the primary consumer is the krill, the zooplankton. And then for secondary consumer, you could have said either the cod or the seal because they're both secondary consumers. B says, other than showing which organisms are consumed by other organisms, describe what is indicated by the direction of the arrows in the diagram. And I've said it a few times today, but you should remember that those arrows show the flow of energy among trophic levels. It's showing the direction of energy flow from one organism to the next. So this is the part that I would like you to do for homework. So this is part, well, let me go ahead and read the top part. It says, as the amount of sea ice has decreased, larger expanses of the Arctic Ocean are now completely free of sea ice for several weeks each summer. ringed seals, the preferred prey of polar bears, comes to holes in the sea ice to breathe. So C and D asks you about this problem and why that's affecting polar bears' ability to hunt and feed, and how there's a feedback loop with the melting sea ice. What I want you to answer for tomorrow is E. E says many species, including some whales and birds, will travel thousands of kilometers during annual migrations. So EI, provide one reason a species may migrate a long distance. So just one reason, provide. II says the North Atlantic right whale migrates between subtropical and polar waters annually. Nearly 50% of the right whale deaths are due to human activities. Describe one commercial activity other than whaling that may result in the death of right whales. So we're identifying a problem here. Now let's do a solution. EIII says, describe one strategy that could reasonably be implemented to decrease right whale deaths caused by the commercial activity you described in part II. I'll focus your attention again on the word reasonably. We've talked about solutions before. Just be sure that your solutions that you are proposing are practical, realistic, reasonable. So just one more quick reminder, we know that connectivity might be an issue for some students. So we're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, you can reach us at the URL below. So thank you for watching. I was glad to virtually see you today. And tomorrow, Ms. Fassler will be here and she will start you off by answering the question about the Arctic food web that I left you with. All right, have a good rest of the day.